Alright guys, how's it going? This has been a very busy week for me this week. So this is going to be more of an update video. I'm basically just going to cover some of the interesting news of the past week. Maybe there'll be one or two things in there that you missed. This is the run up to Computex week, and it's a very busy time for most people in the tech press. There's a lot of stuff goes on behind the scenes, and it's not something that we can talk about because a lot of it is under non-disclosure agreement, yeah? And I have also been going through a real preparation phase for June because there's going to be a lot happening in the entire month. I'm going to start off by finishing off with the Nvidia stuff for this month. May was very much Nvidia's month, of course, with the launch of the GTX 1080, and I got 3 videos out on it, to the best of my ability without actually having the cards and the marketing materials. But now all the attention is turning to the GeForce GTX 1070 instead, the reviews of which we should see in around about 2 weeks. But anyway, we now have the official specs of the GTX 1070, and it's a little bit disappointing, I think. Certainly from what I've been reading and watching in the rest of the press, they're not impressed by this 1920 CUDA cores, and the clock speeds are not awesome either. If you just compare to the 1080, 1080 has 2560 CUDA cores. This is the full GP104 die, and it has the base clock of 1607. I'm only going to go on the base clock because you probably know by now that there is a throttling issue with the Founders Edition, and I'm not even going to count these boost clocks. But anyway, going back to the specs, the teraflops number of the GTX 1080 comes in around 8.2 teraflops. The 1070 is only going to be 5.8 teraflops. Simply double this 1920 CUDA cores, that gives you 3840, and multiply by 1.506 for 5.8 teraflops. That is a difference of 41%. The 1080 has 41% higher teraflops, so theoretically it should be 40% faster. It very rarely works out like that in reality. And over at video cards, they reckon that the 1080 will only be 24% faster than the 1070. I'm not entirely sure how legitimate these benchmarks are. Nvidia's CEO did say that it would be faster than the Titan X, but it's well down on teraflops numbers, and it's also well down on bandwidth, so I guess we're going to have to wait and see. I've got a feeling that it's going to be one of those cases where the 1070 beats the 980 Ti in some games, and loses in others. When it comes to overclocking, when both are overclocked, then I would expect the 980 Ti to be the winner. So just be aware of the marketing again. The 1070 looks like a good card, and when the price comes down to $380 and they get rid of this Founders Edition crap, it will be a very nice card for the money. Around about 980 Ti performance. What you're getting is the true successor to the 970, and it looks like a pretty good card. I, however, will be waiting on Nvidia's partners, getting their custom versions out, and hopefully at the $379 MSRP. These are all things I'll be paying pretty close attention to. Now, in another piece of Pascal news, we have finally got evidence of GP102. Now, if you recall, Nvidia launched Pascal with the GP100, very large GPU built for the high-performance computing sector. This is the one that's got high bandwidth memory, NVLink, basically all the stuff that the consumer GPUs didn't get. Now, in the video I made about that, I said that it didn't look like a very good consumer GPU because it had all this high-performance computing stuff, the FP64, FP16, all this stuff for AI and deep learning, all that kind of stuff. It's no good for gaming. All it would do would take up die space and additional power. And that's why I believed that there would be a GP102. GP104, as you can see here, is the GeForce GTX 1080. We've got GP100 away up here. And now, the AIDA64 developers. AIDA64 is some kind of system information benchmarking software, and they basically got hold of the entire list of the Pascal stock keeping units, that's SKUs, showing their PCI device IDs. As you can see, there are an awful lot of them. Each one of these IDs is one of Nvidia's stock keeping units. I cannot remember a time when I have seen so many. Basically speaking, each of these are going to be different cards, but many of them are of course based on the same GPU. For example, the one we're talking about, GP102. Now this GL will be quadro versions, but the ones we're interested in, just the simple GP102A, this is your 1080 Ti. This is your next Titan. and this is the first confirmation that it actually exists. It had to exist for me, because the GP100 would not have been good enough to defeat Vega. GP102 might not be either, because there was another rumour recently suggesting that it won't have high bandwidth memory. This is what makes sense to me. To me, Nvidia has split Pascal. They've gone with the real Pascal. GP100, this is the one with HBM and NVLink. All the rest of the chips underneath it are simply Maxwell on speed, which incidentally, back in the 6th of October 2015, when I did my very first DX12 analysis, where I pointed out that AMD had a large DX12 advantage, what I said back then was Pascal would only cover GP100, the big Pascal, and that Maxwell was likely to cover the rest. For example, the GTX 980 Ti becomes the GTX 1070, and so on. That was back in October last year when I basically predicted what would happen here. And I just like to remind people of that, especially the ones that gave me stick for it. But anyway, back to GP102. I don't believe it's going to have HBM memory, but we know that Vega will have. So there is a potential advantage for AMD here when the 1080 Ti and the next Titan takes on Vega. Let's not forget that AMD already had that advantage with the Fury X. Yet looking at the benchmarks, you wouldn't exactly know it. So yeah, obviously HBM's a great technology. Whether or not AMD can put it to full use is another matter. GDDR5X on the GP102 may actually be good enough. As soon as we start seeing benchmarks of Polaris, we get a better idea of that. Right, so done with Nvidia, and talking about Polaris, and once again over at videocards.com, where they claim to have found results of the AMD Radeon R9 480 in 3D Mark 11. There were a bunch of different results here that don't really make an awful lot of sense, in all honesty. And all these codenames here, the 67DF, C4, C7, I believe all of this came from Linux driver leaks months ago. And you can see here that for some reason all of the clock speeds are at 1266 MHz. In most cases this would not happen. Your lower tier cards, for example in this case the C4, would normally have a lower core clock speed. But anyway, here's a bunch of scores to have a look at. Apparently, the C7, which would be what we know as Polaris 10, what we think may be the fastest Polaris 10, is coming in here just below the R9 Fury, a little bit below Fury X and the 980 Ti, around about 10% less in fact, which is what I said it would probably come in at, I think in my second Polaris Pascal video. There's a crossfire result with exceptionally poor crossfire scaling. That's like 43% crossfire scaling. There's no way crossfire's that bad, especially not in a synthetic benchmark like this. All of this stuff, I just do not believe any of it any longer. So instead of all this stuff, what I'm really looking for is stuff like this over at Seeking Alpha, where AMD had attended the 44th annual JP Morgan Global Technology, Media and Telecom Conference. And this is a transcript from Seeking Alpha, which is a financial website. Now this JP Morgan Global Technology thing, it's sort of like a split of technology and finances. And you tend to find that the guys at this just don't straight up lie like they do at their own things. If you pay attention to what they're saying and what they're not saying. And that's basically what I'm going to have a look at now. And one or two little nuggets of information were found in here, with most of the talk being on Polaris and ZEN. Representing AMD were their executives Mark Papermaster, who is their SVP and CTO, and also Ruth Cotter, Chief Human Resources Officer and SVP of Corporate Communications and Investor Relations. And they were interviewed by JP Morgan's analyst Harlan Sur. Now on page 2, Mark Papermaster was asked about Polaris, and he said that it was on track to roll it out mid this year. So he talks a bit about FinFET technology being quite significant, and that the foundries have done a great job and that we've leveraged that with Polaris. He then goes on to talk about Polaris being a perfect follow-on to what they did on very, very high performance last year with Fury, and that with Polaris they have now come back with FinFETs right into the sweet spot of the market. Now the sweet spot of the market, around about $200 to $350, that sort of range, and this is where we expect Polaris to come in. AMD has been saying this for months now, that this is going to be bringing down the cost of VR. They are aiming for the mainstream and the sweet spot of the market. So forget about these cards costing $500 or more, there is no way that's going to be the case. One of the more interesting questions that Harlan asked Mark was, your competitor just released their Pascal platform. As you look at the early specs and the early benchmarks, what's your feel in terms of the Polaris architecture relative to their Pascal architecture? And Mark says that, so first and foremost, both companies are going to leverage FinFETs. As we know, Pascal was built on TSMC's 16nm FinFET process, whereas AMD's Polaris will be built on a 14nm FinFET process from Global Foundries. But Mark goes on to say, when you look at Pascal, it's largely just that, and continues with, what you'll see AMD do is drive both design and process, so you're going to see a generational performance advantage from both aspects. In other words, it's pretty much what I talked about in the Maxwell on-speed video. And now AMD's CTO is coming out and saying basically the same thing. Pascal is basically the same architecture as Maxwell on FinFETs. The big gains from Pascal all came from the extra clock speed that the 16nm FinFETs provided, and what he is saying is that in AMD's case, 14nm process and the new GCN design are going to give generational performance advantages from both. That's quite a statement to make, in all honesty. It's a little bit like saying, I'm not all that impressed by Pascal, which incidentally is quite similar to what Nvidia said about AMD 4.5 years ago. Except Nvidia came out and said it directly. They expected more from their competitor's new architecture. And they were right to say that because AMD's 7970 got off to a very slow start and it was beaten by a smaller GPU, the GTX 680. I knew when I read this years ago that Nvidia had a faster card. You just don't say stuff like that unless you're faster. In this case, I would have to say that it just seems like too much of a stretch to imagine that AMD is faster with their smaller chip. What Papermaster here is saying is not quite as aggressive. For me, it's more likely to be an equalising. Nvidia is so far ahead with Maxwell anyway, in terms of performance per watt, which is what all these guys care about. Nvidia is so far ahead with Maxwell anyway, that it's more likely what Papermaster is thinking about here is more equal competition, rather than AMD going ahead. That's just how I interpret this. But remember, we do know what Pascal can do, and Papermaster is one of the very few people that actually knows what Polaris can do right now. And once again over the page, Ruth reiterates that they are really looking to nail the mainstream of the GPU market with this product offering, and that is the largest volume portion of the market. And when asked about the financial side of things, she says, we will be seeing Polaris in volume in the third and fourth quarters of this year. So really from July onwards we can expect very good availability of the Polaris cards. Now at these conferences it's quite common to be asked questions at the end of it. And another analyst asked, should we expect a 1080 competitor or should we have to wait for Vega for that one? Now what I noticed was they did not answer this question directly. However, what Ruth said was, we have this Polaris family and then that is followed on by another family in 2017. Of course, talking about Vega. So this seems to put paid to the rumour that Vega will be here in October. And she actually goes on to say, it is actually a very tight cadence in terms of how you would normally launch products into the market. There might be a longer time frame associated between new architectures. In other words, you would expect maybe 18 months to 2 years before you saw a change in architecture. But that's not going to be the case with Vega. However, I guess based on this, we could be looking at up to a year after Polaris is launched before we actually see Vega. That October rumour that was doing the rounds, I never liked it. And judging by this, we are at least 7 months and probably closer to a year away from actually seeing Vega. Possibly even more interestingly though, she continued with, Polaris will ramp over a series of quarters. So if we think about third quarter, fourth quarter, and then maybe the first quarter of 2017. But now she's talking about the performance and the mainstream portion of the market. Now, up until this point, Polaris was being aimed at the mainstream portion of the market. This is what AMD were saying over the previous months. Performance market is slightly ahead. Now, if we look at one of AMD's graphics slides, we can see how they segment their cards. Now, this is from last year, but you can see up at the top, the enthusiast segment has cards like the 295X2 and the 290X and 290. In the performance segment, you've got stuff like the 285, the 280X, and the mainstream is the sort of lower end stuff, your 260X, that kind of thing. So up until this point, Polaris was supposedly just being aimed at the mainstream, but now it's being aimed at the performance and mainstream. And Ruth continues with, then you follow it on with a new family in terms of the ultra enthusiast portion of the market. So Vega being aimed at the ultra enthusiast should give you an idea of what AMD will be targeting with their Vega GPU. Now another good question over the page where Papermaster was asked to comment on the availability of GDDR5X for the next 6 months. And once again we got a kind of half answer. You can tell a lot by what they're not saying, yeah? And he talks a bit about seeing a bit of life left in GDDR5, and then he talks a little bit about high bandwidth memory and low latency. But the important part here was he talks about how in a graphics card you've got a lot to balance, especially when the performance gains are such that they account for the additional powering area of a new memory standard that may entail. For me, it's sort of like saying GDDR5X is not really going to work on Polaris, and we already know that Vega is going to have HBM, so for me, no GDDR5X for AMD, at least not this year. That is how I analyse that one, but he is quite evasive on it. So you never know. There's no reason why AMD couldn't do something similar to what Nvidia has done with the GTX 1080, which is basically a Halo part, very low volume part. If Polaris is powerful enough to make use of that extra bandwidth, then AMD will do that. Even if it's only for 5-10% extra performance, there is no question that AMD will go for a card like that if the GDDR5X is worth the additional power cost. So like I said, they also talked a bit about ZEN, but before I move on to that here on Seeking Alpha, I'm going to take a look at some materials that AMD has recently released on ZEN. So AMD had this investor presentation this month where they're talking about their CPUs. Now their upcoming APU is still based on the Bulldozer architecture. This is Bristol Ridge, but we can clearly see from the graph on the left that AMD is still making some decent improvements here. 50% performance per watt is massive. But remember, they are starting from a much lower point. It's a lot easier to improve on something that's not very good compared to something that is very good. But AMD has continued to improve performance over the years, but very few enthusiasts are paying attention to it. I talked about this in the ZEN video. There is only so much that anybody can do with a bad architecture, and what AMD has done is double down on power. We can see here that since 2009 over at the left here, this was on 45 nanometers with Tigris, and Danube was also 45 nanometers. So back in 2010, then in 2011 they finally moved on to 32 nanometers. This was with Llano and Trinity and Richland, before finally moving on to 28 nanometers, which in all honesty was pretty much 32 nanometers on a slightly different process. Moved on to 28 nanometers with Kaveri, and they've been there ever since. Moved on to Carrizo, which is based on the Excavator core. It is still Bulldozer, but it's a pretty enhanced Bulldozer. And they talk about leadership, power features, and world-class power management. So back over at Seeking Alpha, and Papermaster is talking about this. There's 25x reduction in energy, 25x improvement in energy efficiency from 2014 to 2020 in the mobile space. So here we can see 2014 all the way up to 2020. And what he has basically said is, but most importantly, they've done it by design. It's like what I said. AMD has been stuck on 28 nanometers for what seems like forever and a day. And even though they've been stuck with that crappy Bulldozer core, they have put so much effort into power management techniques, and that will be carried forward into the ZEN core. So everything they have learned, all of that stuff they put into power management, will carry over to ZEN as well. All that power management on the 14 nanometers, a brand new core, new cache system. So this slide was raising a few eyebrows. The original slide showed Orochi, which was the Bulldozer die, Bulldozer and Pile Driver die, and then the Summit Ridge, which is the ZEN die. Now sadly we don't have anything on the axes, however you can see that Summit is twice the height of Orochi, and at the top it says there is a significant performance leap expected. That's twice as fast. Bulldozer's a terrible CPU. Cannot reiterate that enough, but if ZEN is twice as fast, you just don't see those kind of increases in CPU performance these days. It's more like 10% every year. But yes, AMD is starting from a pretty low point, but twice that low point is still very, very fast indeed. They maybe thought that this slide was giving too much away, because in the next presentation, they've got rid of this and replaced it with this one on the right. Now showing the 40% IPC improvement, and we know that this is over the current generation Excavator core. And a few days ago, over at itwire.com, AMD's corporate VP of Worldwide Marketing, John Taylor, suggested that ZEN had finally caught up to or surpassed Intel's Skylake offerings by saying, ZEN will compete with Intel on performance, power, and specifications, not just price. Now obviously when you've got poor CPUs, you are forced to compete on price. But if what John's saying is true, that is no longer the case. But near the bottom he continues with, for the first time since I have been at AMD, I can say with absolute confidence that AMD has the products and strategies to change any negative perceptions customers may have had. And right at the very bottom, it's almost like he's been scared of saying too much, where he says, "We are far closer to Intel than ever before. You always need a number 2 to keep them honest." Interesting stuff indeed. Now, to finish this one off in ZEN, at an earlier annual shareholder meeting on the 12th of May, this wafer shot was discovered down the bottom left, and it was of nothing that we had ever seen before. You can quite clearly see that it is a very rectangular shape with two very obvious separate areas. Now, I was actually following this a few days ago while it was happening, and Thomas Ryan over at Semi-Accurate noticed this on the presentation. And with this blown up shot, we can quite clearly see that we're looking at two separate areas of logic on a very long rectangular die. So some of the biggest guys in the industry, guys like Hans de Vries, decided to blow the picture up even more. And we can quite clearly see here we've got 4 ZEN cores with a big bunch of cache in between on each side. We can also see a couple of DDR4 memory controllers up here and down here. The south bridge is over here, but this was the interesting part. We can just see here very obvious long thin areas which could well be AMD's new GMI links. We're not entirely sure about this, but this could be AMD's new high-speed communication link. Whatever it is, very interesting, and we finally have the first die shot of ZEN. It is a native 8-core CPU, this long rectangular thing, 4 cores in each, and they reckon it's around about 160 square millimeters, which is only half the size of Bulldozer. So very exciting times indeed. And finally, over at Seeking Alpha once again, Papermaster once again said, talking about ZEN, when you have that kind of jump in performance, we're going to prioritise the markets that are performance hungry. So in order, they will be going first to high performance desktops, followed by servers, and we can expect to see a very small trickle of these, I believe, right at the end of 2016. I'm pretty sure they're not going to be cheap though. Based on this, it seems pretty clear that AMD is back in CPUs in a big way. Whether or not they can really be faster than Intel, I'm not sure. But the scene is definitely setting for a very interesting second half of 2016. Not just on graphics, but on CPU as well. Intel does have their own thing coming pretty soon, but that's something else I will talk about pretty soon. Right guys, the winner of Duskers was El Cid, so he won that copy of the game. Congratulations to him. June is going to be a massive month and we can expect to hear a lot more from Computex. I'll be covering a lot of different stuff in June, doing some more PC builds, talking more about the new benchmarking system I'm going to be doing, and one or two little different things as well. As always, there's a bunch of links in the description below and a lively chat as well. I'll catch you later guys.